Olá a todos e todas, boa tarde. É com muito prazer que damos as boas-vindas a vocês da sessão Cisnes, Verdes e o Capitalismo Regenerativo. Eu sou Ana Lúcia Mello, diretora-adjunta do Instituto Ethos, e serei a moderadora dessa atividade. Nós agradecemos a presença, né? Temos a grande honra de receber hoje a presença de John Elkington, que é uma autoridade mundial em responsabilidade corporativa, capitalismo sustentável, autor de best-seller, empreendedor e que tem tido um papel de embaixador do futuro. John recentemente lançou o livro que tem em tradução livre para o português Cisnes, Verdes, a nova expansão do capitalismo regenerativo. Também estará conosco o Ricardo Yang, co-fundador do Instituto Ethos e presidente do conselho do nosso Conselho Deliberativo. O Ricardo vai ter o papel de comentar aquilo que o John Elkington for apresentando para nós. Logo em seguida, nós vamos ter uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. E, desde já, fica o convite para vocês interagirem conosco. Eu estou fazendo a minha fala com pausas para que a tradução chegue ao John Elkington. Nessa exposição, John Elkington abordará seu mais recente livro, que dialoga com o famoso best-seller Cisne Negro, o impacto do altamente improvável, de Nassim Taleb, publicado em 2007. O que é um cisne verde? Como eventos significativos podem conduzir mudanças positivas de paradigmas, valores, políticas, tecnologias, modelos de negócio e outros fatores. A ideia é que nessa sessão, John nos fale sobre esse conceito e discorra sobre como transitar para um modelo que oferece progresso exponencial na forma de criação de riqueza econômica, social e ambiental, dando também destaque à urgência climática. É importante dizer que esse é um modelo, né, que assume a necessidade de reinvenção do capitalismo em um momento em que o capitalismo certamente está em crise. No caso brasileiro, ainda mais, considerando a questão da desigualdade, né, que ainda é mais agravada nesse momento de pandemia. Ainda em função da pandemia, quando nos tornamos obrigados a repensar modelos de relação social, não só de relação social, mas também de produção, em entendemos que há espaço para que o setor produtivo, além de governos e sociedade, para que façam a escolha certa e estejam do lado certo da história. Nós pedimos ao John que traga essa proposta, né, que ele vem desenvolvendo, de quais são as escolhas que precisam ser feitas no momento, que serão chave para a sociedade que se encontrará no futuro. Nós agradecemos ao John por estar conosco. Damos as boas-vindas a ele e pedimos que compartilhe a sua visão.
Thank you, Anna. Hola, bom dia. Ricardo, wonderful to see you again. I look forward to the conversation. So if I can have the first slide, please. I can't see the slide. Thank you. So my theme is very simple. It is that the world is being disrupted and the sustainability industry is going to be disrupted as well. And I will talk about regeneration, not just regeneration of capitalism, but regeneration of the natural world and our societies. And Anna touched on the inequalities which Brazil suffers from, but the COVID-19 crisis has shown that every society suffers from inequity. So next slide, please. So just very quickly, by way of introduction, I'm 70 years old, so I'm a baby boomer. I've been 45 years professionally involved in environment and sustainability. I've set up 4 social businesses since 1978, and they all still exist. I've been a member of over 70 boards and advisory boards, including, I'm proud to say, the international board of Instituto Ethos many years ago. And I've just published my 20th book, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the hummingbird is the symbol of my latest organization, which is now 12 years old, Volans, founded in 2008. The first UK B Corporation, a pretty wide-ranging client base. One of the things that we've been doing recently, which I will touch on, is carrying out an inquiry into the future of capitalism. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're planning to do around green swans. So next slide, please. So this is the book. It came out in April. Not great timing, since many bookstores around the world were closed. But actually, it's been fantastic to see how it's been picked up on the internet, online. I've now done virtual conferences in 29 countries, but really looking forward to the discussion here today. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram that many of you will have seen, but I think it's a very powerful one, and it's very relevant for where we find ourselves today. It was put together originally by people at Singularity University in California. And what it shows is a set of lines. The first one is a very straight line, and that's how our brains are educated and designed in a way to think about reality. And there's that curving line, and that is the exponential line. And that's what we're increasingly going to see as we move into the next decade. Next slide, please. And many people have looked at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they think what they see there is a set of incremental goals, things that can be done, at the pace, at the speed that a particular company decides is relevant. They see it as an agenda, which is asking them, companies, businesses, to be nicer, to be better, to be more open, and to share a little bit more of the wealth that they generate, and share some of the products and services to those who cannot afford them. I think that's a fundamental mistake. I think if you just look at the first two global goals, no poverty and zero hunger, both of those would be exponential goals, even if you were talking about 2050 or 2060. But here we're talking about the year 2030 as the deadline for the delivery of all 17 goals. So exponential change is almost built into the agenda that we are talking about today. Next slide, please. So the next set of slides are very much around this very strange decade or 10-year period that we're moving into. Next slide, please. And one of the things that COVID-19 has done is to sort of clean out many of the parliaments and the places where political discussions had happened, and they've gone increasingly virtual. Next slide, please. And at the same time, we have populism. And it's in my country, it's in countries now around the world. Next slide. And it's at the same time, you've got a set of challenges that are exploding all around us. So, for example, President Trump, it pains me to use that term about him, but President Trump is now struggling with not only COVID-19, but Black Lives Matter and a range of other issues. Next slide, please. And isn't it interesting that in the midst of all of this, younger people are now starting to find their voice. Now, Greta Thunberg is an extraordinary young woman, but it's extraordinary, I find, to see how her words, her thinking, has cut through all of that background noise and got through to ordinary people in different parts of the world. Next slide. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is a diagram that I've been using for about 2.5 years now. And it basically suggests that we are moving into a very big discontinuity in global affairs. So on the left, you have an old order, which we've all grown up in, we've all to some degree benefited from, which is starting to come apart. And that's a macroeconomic order, it's a geopolitical order, it's in effect the post-Second World War world. And where I think we are now is in it where that old system starts to die at an accelerating pace, and the pink or red line at the bottom shows one of the results. Ordinary people become increasingly anxious, they become fearful, and they increasingly become angry as well. Now, I think that process has only just begun. I think it will last at least for another 12 to 15 years. And I think in the middle of that, a new economic and political order is being born, but it's going to be very, very challenging to make sure that it comes through at the right speed, at the right scale, in the right way. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 has been extraordinary in many ways, but I think one of the things it has done is to accelerate trends that already existed in our world. Yes, it's exposed inequalities in different parts of the world. It's exposed the way in which business has been using, for example, tax havens. It's created a very different corporate responsibility agenda. Let me have the next slide, please. And this is just a very simple point. Many of you will have seen that Tesla has just overtaken Toyota to become the world's most valuable car company. So who would have predicted that a few years ago? I've tracked Elon Musk for 15 years now, and I'm still amazed at what that man has managed to achieve. But sustainability is not, for example, about everyone in the world driving a Tesla electric car. It is about changing the system, changing the way economics operates, and as a result of that, the way that markets and business operate. Next slide, please. So this is to my point about the sustainability industry now needing to be disrupted. So next slide, please. And I'm one of the people who, over the last 30 years and counting, has encouraged companies to open up and produce corporate responsibility or sustainability or pre-financial reports. And there's some wonderfully attractive and aesthetic examples of that now. Next click, please. But at the same time, we're seeing that mainstream being accompanied by some very strange trends indeed. And so when a Siberian coal company can talk about how sustainable its operations are, something has gone wrong in this world of ours. Next slide, please. And this statistic, which is from United States, obviously, but BCG recently did a survey which suggested that over 90% of professional investors would prioritize their financial performance over anything to do with environmental, social, or governance factors. So yes, ESG is growing very rapidly, but we really have a very big gap still to bridge. Next slide. This is, I think, one of the most frightening slides I have ever seen, or one of the most frightening images. And what it shows is 400,000 years of the Earth's history and what's happening with the carbon content of the atmosphere. Next slide. And I think we're beginning to see just the very thin edge of what's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years, which is that forced migration will start to be seen in many different parts of the world. Next slide, please. And we're seeing the corporate impact of that. So, for example, early last year, the power utility PG&E in California was forced to declare bankruptcy. Some of its facilities had helped spark some of the Californian fires, which were absolutely devastating. This is a rather more long-term vision. It's not a particularly pleasant one. Last year I was in Shanghai. I was on the 27th floor of the tower block, looking down onto the scene, but without the flooding. This is a visualization of what would happen. Next slide, please. This is a visualization of what will happen to Shanghai if we get to 2 degrees of warming. Shanghai, as many of you will know, has a population of 24 million people. At 2 degrees warming, we will see half of them dispossessed. And at 4 degrees warming, which some people are beginning to argue is inevitable, pretty much everyone in Shanghai will lose their homes. This is a level of stress on the global system, which I think most of us still struggle to get our brains around. Next slide. Now, I'm a great enthusiast about the B Corporation movement and B Lab that sort of operates behind all of that. My own organization, as I said, was the first UK or British B Corporation. They embraced the idea of the triple bottom line. I see companies like Natura really pioneering in that world. But, can I have the next slide, please? 2 years ago, exactly, I recalled the triple bottom line, which I had introduced 25 years earlier. And this was the first drawing that I had a cartoonist from the Financial Times newspaper draw for me then, back in 91, 92. Next slide, please. And this was the headline from the Harvard Business Review when I withdrew or tried to launch a product recall for the triple bottom line. And I'm going to explain a little bit about why I did that as a way of getting into the Green Swan discussion. So next slide, please. So earlier last year, I was walking through Copenhagen airport when one could still fly. And on the counter in the lounge, I saw this huge Great Banner headline on the front, again, of the Financial Times newspaper. And it was one of the growing number of signals that we're seeing now in different parts of the world that even capitalists even people who are most interested in capitalism, see a need for a profound change. Next slide. And I think what we're seeing is the end or the fading of the Milton Friedman world, a reality which businesses operated in for 60 plus years now, where governments were pushed to one side, really not necessary, and where business and the financial bottom line were absolutely all important. Next slide, please. So this is now moving on to black and green swans. Next slide, please. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb has already been mentioned by Anna, and this is just a reminder of what that book, published in 2007, just before the financial discontinuity began, what that book said, which is that every so often there are events that come along that are complete surprises. They take us completely unawares. Secondly, they have an off-the-scale level of impact. But thirdly, and this is the really worrying point, very often when they've happened, we look back at what's just happened to us. We think we understand it, but generally we fail to properly understand it. And that really sets us up again to fail in the future. Next slide. And I just think it's very interesting to see some companies using almost the excuse of a black swan event to explain what's happened to them with dam bursts or whatever. And I think when people talk about black swans, they should be very careful about what they intend. And it's very interesting that Nicholas Taleb has said that the COVID-19 pandemic is not a black swan. People saw it coming. We should have acted. We very often fail to act. Next slide, please. So, and again, I mentioned this question that's coming up in more and more business leaders' brains. Are they or will they be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history? Now, this is Shell's CEO a short while ago talking about exactly that point and saying that as values change, people will look back at what a company like Shell was doing even a few years ago and basically say, what the hell did you think you were doing? Now, for the CEOs now to say that, I think is a very interesting indication of this acceleration process that's happening all around us. Next slide, please. And I don't want to rule out, for example, fossil fuel companies making the transition to more sustainable energy patterns. So, for example, Petrobras, I see as among the sponsors of this event, and thank you for that. One of the companies that we've been working with in Finland is the old state oil company there, which is called Neste. And one of the things they're doing is that about 70% of their profits now come from renewable energy. And they're going very strongly into the circular economy space. They're looking at renewable jet fuels. They're looking at materials, polymers made from domestic waste. Some very exciting trends beginning to build. Now, I don't believe that Neste is the third most sustainable company on the planet. And I think some of these rating schemes really need a close look. But they are among the leadership group, I would say. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So now I'm going to go towards a conclusion into the world of green swans. So next slide, please. We just recently published a report, or a short report, with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, looking at the impact and the implications of the pandemic. That's available online, should anyone want to see it. I think it's a good piece of work. And the next slide, please. But underlying all of this, there's a different set of trends at work. And this diagram is based on work we've done with a series of companies and with one regulatory agency, looking at the underlying patterns in what's going on in the wider world at the moment. And my view is that we're moving from an agenda for business, which is largely focused on responsibility, into a period where resilience, how our economies, how our cities, and so on, how our supply chains adapt to fairly disruptive change. Resilience is now much talked about. But the only way longer term that you get true resilience are economic resilience, social resilience, environmental resilience, is by regenerating many of those systems that we depend on. And so we've got to invest in our economies, we've got to invest in our societies, and most crucially of all, we've got to invest in the natural environment in ways that we haven't really even dreamt of today. Next slide, please. And this is the green swan definition. I will not read it out. We already have some companies wanting to brand themselves green swans. That's not our intention. I even came across a young woman in the Philippines who has green swan on her business card. That is not our intention. What we're talking about is market shifts that take us exponentially towards a better future. And along the way, this is the second bullet point, deliver simultaneously against the economic, social, and environmental bottom line. So this isn't a trade-off any longer. This is actually achieving three things at the same time. And next slide, please. If I'm asked for an example of a green swan, and one of the things we just set up is what we call a green swan observatory, and I'll end on that in a moment. But the picture of the flags, the European flags, is a symbol of the Green Deal that the European Union has recently launched. They have a number, a figure, which is 1 trillion euros. So it's a very large number. But I think it's very interesting. You see a growing number of governments starting to think about how do they build back better, but do so in a way which means that the recovery is much greener than it once would have been likely to be. So next slide, please. Now, technology obviously plays a critical role in all of this, and I'm not going to go in any depth into all of that, but this is a very dramatic slide. So it's looking at the period through to 2050, and it's looking at what will very likely happen with solar energy costs. And what you see is solar energy becoming almost free. It will never become actually free, but undercutting the costs of energy produced by any form of fossil fuel very rapidly. Next slide, please. And this is almost my last slide. One of the things that we're talking about alongside the green swans is ugly ducklings. Ugly ducklings, if you remember the Hans Christian Andersen's story, looked very peculiar. They looked weird. They didn't look like what they would later become, which was a beautiful swan. They just looked odd. Next slide. Thank you. And around the world, you're starting to see all sorts of things popping up that look really quite strange. This is the Waymo vehicle. I wouldn't be terribly keen to drive it, but it's the beginning of a process whereby the global transportation system moves to autonomous vehicles, a shared vehicle fleet, all sorts of things beginning to happen, which have massive repercussions potentially for the oil industry, for the automotive industry, and the success in a way of Tesla is very much part of that. Next slide. And the reason why Natura is there is, 50 years ago when Natura was starting, who would have thought it would become the sort of organization and enterprise that it is today, with a set of values that it's managed to sustain over that time. Now, the reason that Volkswagen is there as a brand is we know about Dieselgate, shocking behavior by a major company. But as a result of that, and this is sort of almost a black swan leading to a green swan, you have Volkswagen, last time I looked, working on 70 models of electric vehicle. And by 2023, it's now estimated that there will be 500 electric vehicle models in the world. So this is a huge transition that's beginning to happen. And so part of what we're trying to do is to identify some of the early stages of all of that and work out how we best support them. Next slide. Thank you. This is the last slide, and it's just simply to say, an invitation in a way. We're starting to work with universities, with business schools, with innovation networks and so on, to identify some of those early stage green swan market trends and linked potential, but also some of the ugly duckling initiatives and innovation that will potentially drive the global economy in the right and a much more sustainable direction. Have just gone out yesterday to 3 extraordinary pioneers in different parts of the world. And I'd love your advice, your suggestions, your nominations for some of the people you think and some of the institutions you think could drive exponentially positive change in the world. Let me stop there and hand over to Anna and Ricardo.
Obrigada, John, por compartilhar conosco a sua visão, né, e aquilo que você colocou como uma crença, né, de um mundo possível de transitar para uma economia, para uma nova ordem econômica e política que seja mais sustentável. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para o Ricardo Young, para que ele possa comentar aquilo que foi apresentado pelo John, né? Ricardo, usando isso que foi trazido pelo John, né? No início do ano foi publicado o manifesto do foi o capitalismo de stakeholders, né? Numa visão de que é possível ter um caminho para que as empresas tenham prosperidade, é um caminho que tem a expectativa dos acionistas com a expectativa das partes interessadas. Eu vou pedir para você comentar sobre isso, né, o momento que a gente está vivendo, também dialogando, né, com o movimento global, de repensar modelos políticos, sistemas políticos e econômicos, e, ao mesmo tempo, a sua visão sobre como estamos no Brasil, né, e quais são os desafios que temos por aqui também.
Can't hear. Ricardo, you're muted. So has Ricardo gone? Okay.
Enquanto nós aguardamos o regresso do Ricardo, eu queria comentar que, acompanhando o chat pelo YouTube, a gente tem algumas pessoas te cumprimentando, John, pessoas que fizeram parte da história do Ethos, como a Delmara Bex, a Vivian Smith, Patrícia Canachiri e Sheila Saraiva, te cumprimentando e agradecendo por esse momento que está reunindo as pessoas que muitas vezes estiveram com você também na construção desses processos.
Well, I have, for many years, loved Brazil. I look at many countries at the moment and I wonder where we're all headed politically. But I think Brazil has a wonderful potential future. And some of the people I've met in your country, I think are fantastic. But so love to all. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, my email is john@volans.com. So that might make it a little easier.
E eu vou aproveitar para também já trazer alguma... eu vi que tem uma pergunta direcionada a você, John.
Okay.
E aí eu quero já endereçá-la, tudo bem? A Daniela Manoli, ela pergunta por que o mercado financeiro está usando o conceito de Cisnes para anunciar a próxima crise financeira. Ela acha que é um volume equivocado no seu...
So thank you for the question. Language is complicated and is often used in different ways. And the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development used the term green swan at the beginning of this year in a report. And what they meant by that was the risks to the financial system that come from climate change. So this was a black swan dressed up in sort of green feathers for them. That's not what I mean by a green swan. What I mean is, in the same way that a black swan takes you exponentially in a direction that you do not want to go, a negative direction towards problems and challenges, wicked problems, if you like, a green swan is positive. It takes you in directions that you do want to travel, and very often it can take exponentially in that direction. But there's a very big difference between the two. Black swans often happen because we don't think. We fail to recognize that what we're doing in chemistry, in aerospace, or whatever it is, agriculture, forestry, is likely to have unintended consequences. So these things surprise us. Green swans you have to work on year after year, decade after decade, sometimes generation after generation. These are things that you have to invest in long term. So in a way, I'm not surprised that the financial system, if there is such a thing, would prefer to understand green swans as simply one more type of risk driven by climate change in this case. But that's not what I'm intending by the term and in the book.
Obrigada, John, pela resposta. Eu vou verificar se a gente tem mais perguntas na audiência. Por enquanto, não. Nesse sentido, eu gostaria de pedir, John, que você comentasse um pouco mais sobre o que você trouxe no início da sua apresentação, sobre esse processo de mudança, né, de uma visão, de uma transição, e alguns movimentos que hoje existem e que têm ganhado força, falam que o centro do sistema político e econômico deveria ser as pessoas e não as corporações. Eu queria ouvir, assim, como você enxerga essa questão e, principalmente, como que você explorasse um pouco mais a questão das pessoas, dos empregos, as questões identitárias, né, que envolvem mulheres, negros, população indígena. Como que você imagina que isso, essa sua visão, né, de um mundo mais equilibrado, de um mundo mais sustentável, quais são as dinâmicas que você entende que precisam acontecer, que vão acontecer?
So, well, thank you for the question. I think individuals are absolutely critically important in all of this. We can't simply hand it over to governments, system change. We can't simply hand it over to business or to financial markets or whatever. This is something that we as individuals and as networks of individuals and as communities have to ask for, have to demand. And there are different ways in which we can do that, most obviously through voting, although some of the voting behaviors in different parts of the world at the moment are a bit peculiar, like Russians voting for Vladimir Putin to be there for as long as he lives as president or prime minister or whatever he chooses to call himself. But voting is really, really important. But there are different ways in which we as individuals can vote. And some of your audience might remember that when I was with a company called Sustainability back in the late 1980s, we did a book called The Green Consumer Guide. And it sold 1 million copies in 18 months around the world. And that was a moment where ordinary people felt there was a real necessity that they started to choose between products on the basis of what they understood to be their environmental performance. Now, I think we've got there again in some parts of the world. So in my own country, the United Kingdom, Britain, we've seen in the last 2-3 years a very, very strong public demand that plastics, single-use plastics, should be much better controlled. Now, that's been somewhat complicated because COVID-19 has required people to use plastic gloves, plastic face masks, all sorts of different single-use, disposable materials and products. And I was horrified yesterday to see in the Bosphorus near Turkey huge amounts of plastic waste in the sea there. So, you know, this isn't something that goes in a straight line. It goes backwards and it goes forwards. But ordinary people, all of us, are crucial. Now, you mentioned women and you mentioned younger people. And I think they're the most important audiences that we've got to go for. Women tend to make most of the consumer choices in most families, and young people, this is their future. And it's very interesting now to see it's not just Greta. And I've been on some of the school climate strike or climate marches in my own city of London. And I'm very impressed by the level of knowledge of these young people. I'm very impressed by their determination to change things and their sense that this is not something that's going to change overnight. This is something that they need to commit their lives to. Now, I think we've got to support them. And when I was saying a moment ago that women and young people were critical, I also think older people are critical, and not necessarily in the way people might assume. I think older people, and I said right at the beginning, I'm 70, so I am a baby boomer. I see many people of my age, as they get older, they become more conservative. They have wealth, which younger people very often do not have. They have connections, networks, which they can use politically and in other ways. And I think as they get conservative, more conservative, they start to want change to slow down. And yet we need to accelerate change. So we can't ignore older people. We've really got to bring them on board as well. So what we're talking about is not just a social, but a set of cultural changes. And just finally, I think what we're seeing at the moment is the reverse of that. Most of our societies are going in a different direction. And yet that's almost necessary for the rest of us to say, that's not what we want to see happen in our world. That's not the future that we want. It's time for us all to stand up. It's time for us all to act. It's time for us all to send very clear signals, not just to politicians, but to companies and the brands that we buy from and support in different ways. So I think this is probably the most challenging time in my entire working career. And I think the next 10 to 15 years are make or break. I think we either work this out and globally move in the right direction, or our civilization actually will come apart. Ricardo.
Obrigada, John. Ricardo se juntou a nós. Por favor, Ricardo.
I will start in English only to say hello and say the pleasure that I'm having to have you here and listen to you and listen about your new book. And I'm doing my homework, as you can see here, reading your book already.
Thank you.
Okay, John. I would like to make a comment and one of the things you said. Of course, as you showed us, como você nos mostrou no começo, você está trabalhando com sustentabilidade há 30 anos. Então, nós já vimos a Rio 92, depois nós vimos os Objetivos do Milênio, depois nós vimos a Agenda 21, nós vimos agora as ODS. E o que te faz achar que, nesse momento, nós estamos vivendo uma disrupção maior do que aquela que nós vivemos no ano 2000, quando foi criado o Global Compact, maior do que a década de 2000 também, quando nós tivemos os Objetivos do Milênio? Porque o que faz desse momento um momento tão especial e tão disruptivo?
Ricardo, thank you for the question. When I think back at social change, one of the big changes I often think about is the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery. And that took over 100 years. I mean, it lasted for hundreds of years, but it took over 100 years to make happen. And I think we're in a very similar process today, particularly with climate change, but in other areas as well. And I showed right at the end of my presentation a slide with 4 green swan figures, as that we're calling them. And one of those went this morning to Seattle in the United States, to Denis Hayes. You will know Denis. He was the founder of the Earth Day Network. He was one of the co-founders of Earth Day in 1970. And you'll also remember that in 1970, 26 million Americans came out onto the streets and protested. And because of that, we got the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. We got the United Nations Environment Program. We got the sort of Rio +20 and all the rest of the conferences that you described. And now it's 50 years on. And I think what we're seeing is there's somebody who works in Silicon Valley called Tim O'Reilly, and he talks about a gradually, then suddenly world. It's a notion that Hemingway came up with in his writing. But I think we're in one of those moments where things that seem to be completely impossible become both possible and then almost inevitable. Now that can take you in bad directions. Populism is, in politics is an example of that. But it can also, if we decide that that's what we want, and enough of us decide, it can take us in a very different direction. And to your question, I think ordinary people, for the first time in my life, understand that the planet is at threat, not just air quality in their local area or community, not just problems with the local river or whatever it is, but this is something that it potentially impacts future generations, their children, their grandchildren, and so on. If we cannot use that to drive the sort of systemic change that we now need, we almost deserve to die as a civilization, but I choose not to believe that's where we're headed. I think we can step up, but it's going to take quite some time to make this work.
Ok, posso fazer mais uma pergunta, Ana?
Please.
Por favor, Ricardo, mais uma.
John, em que sentido você acha que o Covid-19 acelerou essa perspectiva? E quais são as mudanças que o Covid-19 trouxe que você acha que vão permanecer e são potenciais cisnes verdes?
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things that COVID-19 has shown to all of us, and this has come through to many ordinary people, is how interconnected our world now is. So, for example, the trafficking, the export of wildlife from places like Africa or Thailand to Chinese so-called wet markets in Wuhan, the export of things like bats or whatever it might be, is suddenly giving the whole global economy a really big shaking. So, that is one of these moments where I think many of us begin to be aware that there's a much bigger set of factors at work than we had perhaps realized. Now, most of us don't want to think that the whole time. We'd very gladly go back to sleep. But I don't think we can allow ourselves or the rest of the world to go back to sleep. I think we've got to use the energy that has been unleashed. And when I said COVID-19 has accelerated things, partly that's because it has exposed things that people did not know about or would prefer not to have known about. So wildlife trafficking is one thing. But for example, issues like tax evasion by major companies, major inequities in our societies, poverty, but also very different levels of healthcare provision. All of these things are starting to surface in a way that would be almost to have been unimaginable, say 18 months or 2 years ago. Now, just finally on that, Ricardo, I think most of our political leaders, and that is worldwide, are not fit for purpose. They grew up in a different world. They don't know what's going on. They don't properly understand it. Our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson, whose father was an environmentalist, has said he doesn't understand climate change. Well, they're idiots. And those idiots are going to have to be cleared out. And they will be. By the end of this decade, we will see very different political leaders around the world. Many of them will be much younger. There'll be people we've never heard of, in the same way that we'd never heard of Greta Thunberg, a year or two before she erupted on the scene. And I think that's incredibly exciting. It's going to be challenging, no question. But this is genuinely the most exciting period of change in my entire life. And I'm an optimist, but I try not to be a stupid optimist. I think we're really going to have to work very, very hard and over a very long period of time to get this system shift that we actually all, I think, increasingly recognize as necessary.
It's great to hear you, and it's a pity we don't have more time because of these technical problems, but great to hear you, and I really like your optimism and the way you see the future. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, and Anna, thank you too. And Paolo for the translation. And I just want to end by saying one thing. I know as soon as I can get on the plane, I will certainly come to Brazil, because I love your country, and I like many of the people I know there. But I also just wanted to celebrate what Instituto Ethos has done over the decades. I think yours has been an incredibly important central role, not just in South America, but globally. And I just thank you very much for that.
Muito obrigada, John, por ter estado conosco. Obrigada por ser sempre um grande amigo do Instituto Ethos. Pela exceção que abriu em estar conosco ao vivo aqui, mesmo sendo a noite.
No, a pleasure.
Obrigada a todos por terem acompanhado essa sessão. Nós nos invitamos para a próxima sessão que acontece daqui a pouquinho, às 5h10, no canal do Ethos no YouTube. Muito obrigada, boa tarde.